what the Blue Zone is selling fits with the narrative of what we've heard really since the food pyramid and promotes that further. We tend to be like, okay, I'm going to have this organ and nothing else. That's not the ancestral way. The ancestral way would be to have a little bit of all the organs along with the gelatinous tissue and the skin and everything else. What I've really taken away from all of my travels is that you really only need one pot and a knife. If you have a pot and a knife, you can eat like traditional folks. They cook very simply and very easily, but it's very tasty. When I go to the traditional cultures, they use them on their whole body. It's not just in their diet. So they'll be using yogurt on their skin or washing their hair with yogurt. The fermentations are more infused into the life and less a big lump on the plate. But what tradition is just something that worked. And so they've repeated it. And that's typically what traditional diets are. As different as they are around the globe, they work for there to not just maintain health, but preserve it as well.
Mary, as a world traveler, somebody that spent time in each of the blue zones, I want to talk specifically about the blue zones. What are the biggest myths we have here over in the West when it comes to the way the people there eat and live?
I would say the biggest myth is that the health is coming from specific items within these foods, and that if we bring in more of these foods that they're eating, that we will be as healthy as they are. Whereas in reality, what's being reported as the foods that they're eating is not accurate. And so bringing in the idea of what they're eating rather than what they're actually eating and the way that they're actually living is unlikely to bring in the benefit.
Well, let's get into the specifics. What are they actually eating? Obviously, we're talking about different areas, but really high overview of what's different between what we're being told and what they're eating.
The high level is that they're eating from the foods that are there naturally. They're not importing, and they're also processing things in the traditional ways, which means that their cooking fat is an animal fat, right? It's going to be lard or butter or other things, depending on the region that we're discussing. So they're getting an enormous amount of the caloric intake from these animal fats. So while each of the blue zones differs in the average for what they consume for protein each day, and to be honest, that's seasonal, and that's something that's often very missed. The ones that consume less of the protein, that sounds a little bit more like what's written about in the book, they're consuming quite a bit of their calories from the fat. In fact, it's the bulk, and that's coming from the animal product. So it's really not a plant-based diet. And a lot of that misnomer really comes from it being looked at from an eye of someone who hasn't studied health or nutrition. And going into these regions, you can miss a lot.
Well, let's talk more about the specifics of missing this because it's interesting because there's so many books written about this, and now there's this Netflix documentary. It's being touted, it seems like, everywhere.
Yes.
How are they getting the data that they're using for this misinformation?
I think one of the benefits and also downfalls of our culture in America is that we like bullet point, simple, and get it done, right? And there's a place for that, and there are certain industries where that is fabulous. But with health, not so much. It's really all the small, tiny things. And so, what people will do is they'll go to this region, they'll see maybe a tomato, and they'll be like, we should eat more tomatoes. But the problem is that that's not historical. They didn't have tomatoes 20 years ago or 50 years ago. So that's a new addition. And someone without the history of food is not going to have that to bring to that conversation. Essentially, we're missing the bulk of what's good coming from these cultures while trying to reduce it into something that's very shiny, right? The blue zone sounds fabulous. And the idea of, eat more vegetables and spend more time with your loved ones and exercise more. No one is going to combat that. No one's going to argue with that. But the truth is that when you go to these regions and when you go to other traditional regions, like all the indigenous regions that I go to, that's not the way it is. If we told people to eat the way that I see people eating, they would be up in arms and their doctors wouldn't be happy, right? And so this kind of fits what the blue zone is selling fits with the narrative of what we've heard really since the food pyramid and promotes that further. And so there's no resistance to that. And so it's really taken hold. It's also just very tidy. right? This idea that, oh, we could live forever. I see a lot of more and more books towards this idea that we can live for a very, very long time. And I think it's missing the mark significantly.
You touched on something there I want to dive deeper into. The fact that you used a tomato as an example of maybe a food that they could be eating these days, but might not be a traditional food. Talk about in the blue zones as a whole, how much the diet has changed in the last couple hundred years.
Yes. The bulk of the diet change has really happened within the last 50 years, 50 to 70 years. Some regions later than others. But in general, that's the main change. The only exception I can think of off the bat would be about 600 years ago, some of the animals and therefore the animals that were consumed changed in Okinawa. But otherwise, really the changes happen in the last 50 to 70 years. Now, in Okinawa, that happened with the war. But most regions, it had more to do with export-import and what was culturally accepted. So for instance, in Greece, you got tomatoes and potatoes. So now you see the teenagers and the college kids coming back to their Blue Zone home and eating all of these French fries, which were never part of the diet. And these folks, these kids, unfortunately, they have many of the same health issues that we do, whereas you don't see that with the older generations that weren't eating these foods. In other regions, it was more a change of fats. So in some places, especially if they've more modernized, they've gone from lard and animal fat to vegetable oil. I'm seeing that all over the world. It is really a problem. And that's primarily it. So it's a few vegetables and then the cooking fat. Those are the main things because most of these regions, one of the reasons why they held on to tradition a bit longer than other places is that they are typically either more remote or socially they are due to religion or culture, right? Some of these places have a very different political ideology than the rest of their country. And so they're very tight-knit within themselves and they don't really go to the other places to get, say, pineapples and things like that. They won't do it. They don't trust things from very far away. So there's a lot of that.
Another whole layer to this, too, is the fact that we're assuming going to these different areas that supposedly have the longest lived people, taking what they're doing and eating and bringing it here to, say, North America, that's going to be a good fit when these blue zones are in different climates. They have different access to different foods. And you can't necessarily assume bringing something that's working over here to the West, and that'll work the same way.
That's exactly it. And I would say that's where most of the nutritional downfall has happened during colonialism and post-colonialism. Definitely, because as foods were imported, exported, the skill of how they needed to be produced and also prepared before human consumption was mostly lost outside of the regions for which it's from. And for plants, that's incredibly important how they're processed. You can't just have corn on the cob or popcorn. It has to go through the 5 stages, the nixtamalization, the stone grinding. All of that needs to happen in order for it to be a neutral food and not a problem food, not a toxin for our digestive system, for all mammals, not just humans. And so when you lose that knowledge, you also start bringing in foods when they come from other regions that may not be fully appropriate, right? A lot of the plants have a lot of deuterium in them. Deuterium, for the listeners, that's heavy water. That's the nickname from chemistry class. It weighs down the cell. And it's not typically a problem because you would be consuming these foods in a very sunny environment. But if you're trying to mimic the Costa Rican Blue Zone diet while you're in Ireland, that could cause problems because you're going to be shoring up deuterium, amongst other things as well. There's a great deal of information now coming out from some of the light scientists about how food really changes as it's kept. And so you have to keep something for quite some time in order to ship it far away. And that's affecting the entire cellular structure of these foods. Now, we've known for a long time that if you pick something today, let's say an apple, well, it's not apple season. Let's pretend it's October and we picked an apple. That apple could actually increase in some of the plant toxins as it sits. And also, depending on when it's picked from the tree and when other apples were picked from that tree, it could have more of the negative technical toxins. I'm not using that term in a casual way. It's an actual certifiable toxin for humans, for our digestive system if it's not handled appropriately. Now, the old world way of dealing with that was fermentation. That would get rid of a lot of things, not all plant toxins, but many. So when you're talking about things like the tomatoes that were brought to Greece and Italy, no, fermentation does not get rid of the solanines, which are perhaps one of the biggest problems, but it will really lessen things like lectins. And so it lessens that load and you can have them out of season. But again, all of that knowledge, that was just tradition, right? Because tradition, we tend to poo-poo it or think it's kind of silly. But what tradition is just something that worked. And so they've repeated it. And that's typically what traditional diets are. As different as they are around the globe, they work for there to not just maintain health, but preserve it as well.
If you're enjoying this episode, let me know by tapping like and subscribe below. Thank you so much, and now back to the chat. You're talking about different processing, and whether it be fermentation or the 5-step process for corn. It gets me thinking about us here in the West and some of the biggest foods that we're consuming, not knowing that we're not processing them in a healthful way. And it might even be a healthy food if it is done properly. So what I'm getting at here is, what are some of the foods that we're consuming, assuming they're healthy, besides the tomato and the corn, that need to be processed differently to become a healthful food for us?
That is such a good question, and it is almost all of them. Aside from, say, meat and seafood, it really is almost all of them. So, for instance, all of the top allergens, for the most part, are coming from this category. You take soy. Now, soy was not a food until about 1,000 years ago, the time of the Yellow Emperor, when a farmer discovered that if you fermented it for 6 months, 6 months, folks, then it didn't cause harm. From there on, it started to spread as a condiment, not as a protein staple, right? People were not eating edamame as an appetizer, and they were not having soy protein as a meat substitute, right? This was a topping, a flavor additive, and it was properly fermented. In that way, not causing problems. The fermentation for soy is really quite required due to the lectin. There are toxic lectins and non-toxic lectins, and unfortunately in scientific literature, we do not have a word to discern them. So just know if I speak of lectins, I'm only speaking of the toxic ones. There are lots of non-toxic lectins that exist in plants that are perfectly fine for us. So that fermentation neutralizes it. Now, if you go for sushi, let's say you want some sashimi tonight, the soy sauce that's served on the table is not fermented like that. In fact, almost none is. If you ask for the tamari, which is the gluten-free ferment, that's going to be properly fermented, not as long as I would like. Really, the long ferment is quite expensive, but it is much better. It's going to have a lower lectin content. But again, you go to these restaurants, you're probably going to have tofu and other large quantities of soy. So that would be one. Another would be something like an egg yolk. Now, eggs traditionally were not a problem, but they really started to become a high allergen food when the birds, the chickens, their diet was changed, essentially. So it became, the bulk of the diet came from corn, soy, these kind of foods. Now, a chicken or bird is very different than a mammal, and they can typically handle a good amount of lectins. They can even handle about 70% of their diet from a lectin food, like a corn, and be fine, really, truly fine. But when it's 100%, that is a very different story. And at that stage, when they're not outside picking at the bugs, they really should be eating bugs and shells and all sorts of things. When they're not, then they put that lectin toxin into their fat. And so anything fatty, like an egg yolk or skin, is going to have more of that. And that's going to come to us. That's going to trigger our immune system. And those of us that are more vulnerable or had a rough birth or had more antibiotics, there's so many factors. But those of us that are more sensitive are going to notice it. That doesn't take away the fact that all of us have issues with these lectins. Some of us are just going to notice it faster.
All right, you gave a couple examples there. And as you were talking about the soy, it got me thinking about taking that to the extreme. And a lot of times, people on a plant based diet use that as the base for their protein needs. So I can only imagine over time what that would do to the body.
Exactly. And it also acts on the hormonal system as well, which is very problematic. But it's not the only one. Let's say you do rice protein isolate, right? And you use that instead as a vegetarian or as a vegan. That's going to block your B1. And pretty soon you're going to start to have nerve issues, whether that comes out as high lactic acid, so you're getting anxious and insomnia and you're sore everywhere, or you come down with a real demyelination of the nerves. It will come because you don't really have B1 in your diet and you're blocking it with the rice protein. So the way that we're consuming the foods matters just as much as what the food is. And it's very difficult, at least from my background, to say that a food is blanket good or bad, because it really is a very different food if it's been processed in the ancestral way, and if it's not, and also what it's eaten with in conjunction.
Okay, so what it's eaten with matters, the way it's processed, and when it comes to animal foods, what those animals ate. You gave the chicken example there. I'm assuming to bring that over to the plant realm, we need to look at the soil quality and the plants that have been processed properly and are eaten with the right things. I'm assuming they would have to be grown in the right soil to have proper nutrition.
Yes, definitely. They would. Now, they don't get the toxin load from the soil. So there are some that do. For instance, mushrooms can get oxalates from the soil. But to be honest, that's a bit mysterious. So you take that with a grain of salt because I think there's more going on there. But in general, the soil gives the plants the vitamins, the minerals. And so now our soil is rather sad. And so we're getting about, I think it's about a 15th of the amount of the vitamins that we were 50 years ago from the same amount of food. And so, yeah, the soil is a major issue, but you couple that deficiency within the food, even if you feel like you're eating the best whole food diet, with then also eating foods that block those same vitamins and minerals, and that's where we get into real trouble.
We'll talk about what some of those foods are that we need to be aware of when we're consuming them with nutrient dense foods.
Yes. So if you're consuming a lot of, say, lectin-rich foods like the tomatoes, bell peppers, all of those, you really need very specific glyconutrients in your diet and at all meals. Glyconutrients are long chain sugars, but don't think sweet. They're not. They're medical sugars. And they're very good for multiple functions in the body. This kind of new craze for all the Asian mushrooms and having that instead of coffee, those have some of them. But there are 8 different glyconutrients, and you really need all of them if you're eating those kind of foods to help to buffer the immune system and the nervous system from getting damaged within the gut lining when you consume those. So those would be very important. Some of those are very basic. They're found in things like onions and garlic. Many in the carnivore world, you can get it from bone marrow, from shrimp shells, and all sorts of things. So whey protein has it too. Not the whey protein, I mean, technically, yes, the bodybuilder whey protein, yes, but the traditional form is a liquid, and you get it from the cheese making process. So you get it from that too. So all of those kind of new foods that are hitting the market, colostrum, I've been seeing tons of ads for. That's been a known glyconutrient for a very long time. So the more of those you have, the more buffer you have. So those are always a good idea. With other plant toxins like oxalates, dairy is the key. So dairy really blocks that. Oxalates are crystalline structures that are found in things like raw spinach, but also cooked. Cooked still has far more than you can break down in a week. So quite a bit. And when you have that food with dairy, it helps to buffer it. So that can be really good. For those on a carnivore diet, not doing dairy, lemon juice would do the trick. Now, lemon juice traditionally was always allowed on carnivore diets that were used medically. The real medical way to do the carnivore diet was not so puritanical. It was more about not having fiber. So you could have herbal teas if you did okay with them, and you could do lemon juice and things like that. So that would be an option.
So you mentioned when it comes to oxalates, the dairy being the buffer. I just want to understand the lemon juice part. So when you're having a carnivore diet, what oxalates would you be taking in that you need to buffer?
Well, you can still get them, absolutely. And if you're an endogenous producer as well, some people produce them on their own. It's a small subset of the population, but we're starting to see it more and more. And so if you have that as well, that can be helpful. Now, it's not just producing them. So even if you stop eating oxalates, that's often when you get the worst because your body will get excited and start to get rid of them. And that can cause genuinely very severe symptoms, especially in those who are prone to pH balance issues in the blood. So those with seizures, kidney disease, these kind of conditions, they can go into a state of sepsis very quickly, actually. And so you can start dumping at a rate that your body can't handle or can't get rid of. And so for that, the lemon juice will help with with dealing with that. But it does not work that way when you're eating vegetables and fruit. So that really does only work when you're on a true carnivore diet.
Got it. So to clarify there, it's when you're dumping, if you're on a carnivore diet, or the endogenous oxalates that you're producing with the lemon
That's
juice.
correct. Hmm.
Got it. Okay. You mentioned eggs in the animal realm, the being aware of what the chickens are eating. Any other animal products that we need to be aware of? Because I'm trying to simplify. It's getting
Yes,
complicated with all the different
I know.
toxins. And for
Yeah.
somebody that just wants to go very high level and
Yes.
eliminate a lot of the toxin bearing foods to try and have a clean diet, I'm assuming we're going to lean more towards the meats and the animal proteins.
That's the easiest.
But are there certain things within that realm, like the eggs, that we need to be aware of?
There are, but I would say that's much higher level. So in my private practice, a lot of people, I worked with people from all stratospheres. And so some people had very little to buy groceries each week, and others had unlimited budgets. I saw people heal on the lower quality proteins and fats all the time. So I don't want anyone to ever feel discouraged that because of their budget or because of the difficulty they can't get better or that they have to get a certain kind of food. There are individuals that are more sensitive, right? Michaela Peterson would be a very good example. They definitely are out there and more. So what I always recommend is just go lower toxin if you're trying to reduce while you're educating yourself and learning about this, because it's fascinating, I think. So as you do that, go more towards the meats, and if you do okay with dairy and the egg, that'll automatically lower your toxin load. Then you can learn about the rest. But in general, the fattier that the animal product is, the more important it is that you know the source. So when I'm working with someone with a really tight budget, but maybe not, maybe just a little bit flexible, we'll get the good quality fat because the fat is where all mammals and most animals store their toxins, right? We think of fat as this character flaw, that we've eaten too much and exercised too little. But that is not the purpose of a fat cell. A fat cell is very protective. It grows to protect the organs. It's actually indicative of someone who's pretty healthy in an unhealthy environment. So their body is adapting by creating those fat cells. And what those fat cells do is one of the things they do is to store toxins while the liver is overburdened. So when the liver is overburdened from filtering all those fat soluble toxins, it's going to create those. Now, that does not address lectins. Those go through the kidneys, but that's semantics. So the other ones do, the rest of them do. So essentially, the higher fat it is, the better to have a clean source. So if you're getting butter or if you're getting lard, it would be great to get like a milk-fed lard or a hazelnut-fed lard, right? One of these top shelf items, right? Something that a chef would want. And then if you have extra left over, let's say you're getting a ribeye, a fatty cut, that would be good. Same with salmon. Salmon, you really do. I would say fish, if it's not very lean, you really want it as clean as you can get, because the farm fish are eating very unnatural food and high toxin food for our immune system. And so when you have that, then you can start looking at some of the leaner things. But I would say things like shrimp or pork tenderloin or chicken breast, those are less important to get perfect. The higher fat, the more.
And when somebody wants to go for most nutrient dense, I know there's a whole continuum within the carnivore realm, people that are just having beef, people that are pro and against organs, and then there's, fish and chicken, all the different meats and pork. How do you look at all that from a nutrient standpoint?
As a practitioner, I always just work with what I can with each person, because when people are as sick as my clients tend to be, you don't always have a choice. They may do well with one and not the other. So we go with what we can get into the person. But in terms of in a dream world, if I could just choose, I would definitely have pork high up there, because right now we have a lot of cytokine illnesses, and pork happens to be very high in B1, which regulates cytokines, along with helps the mitochondria process oxalates. It does all sorts of wonderful things, remyelinates the nerves, very important. And we really don't have it in our diets. So we're very deficient in that already, and we have a lot of foods that block it. But if I could only pick one, it would honestly be red meat. Red meat is one of the few things, so aside of beef, it's one of the few things that I could put you on a desert island with and give you nothing else for the rest of your life but a steak every single day, and you would be healthier than you've ever been. We don't have other foods like that. We can't do that if I feed you with rabbit or with chicken, anything else. You start to get, over a long period of time, you can get deficiencies, especially in things like vitamin A. So red meat would be my favorite. Now, the organs are phenomenal. Absolutely phenomenal. And really some of the organs that aren't as consumed even in these kind of new ancestral communities are fabulous and are very much in all the blue zones and also all the indigenous regions that I go to with such good health. So the organs are very important, but it's not as sterilized as we tend to have it, right? We tend to be like, okay, I'm going to have this organ and nothing else. so we'll have a plate of organs, and that's not the ancestral way. The ancestral way would be to have a little bit of all the organs, along with the gelatinous tissue and the skin and everything else. And so it's all kind of consumed by the family or the community together and shared, rather than a hyper focus. That's not to say that a hyper focus can't be beneficial. Foods can be used medicinally in all of these cultures. So you may have an uptick of a certain food for a certain illness, but in general, it's not consumed the way that I'm seeing.
Well, let's get really practical with the organ piece. For somebody that wants to embrace that as part of their diet, you mentioned the diversity, and how do you recommend somebody over in the West to get them in on a regular basis, get a wide array, and not overdo it? I'm assuming, even a good thing like organ meats, we can do too much. So let's get practical and talk about how you recommend somebody incorporate those.
So I'll usually start with the easiest ones. And I'll often, because so many of us are not used to seeing where our food is really from, at least in America, right? So I will usually have them contact a butcher and have the butcher mix in organ meats with their ground beef or ground chicken or anything else. And I'll usually start with heart, because heart is a muscle. So it tastes the most like meat. It has the least organy kind of flavor. So we'll usually start with that. That's full of coenzyme Q10 and all sorts of good things, especially for energy and things that are really needed when you're very ill. So that can be very, very helpful. From there, then I'll kind of spread out based on what the person is dealing with. If someone has a chronic immune deficiency, right? If we're dealing with like an AIDS or someone who has cancer, that's also immune deficiency, or a chronic illness where they tend to get sick every 1 to 3 weeks, right? With whatever's going around, then we'll do thymus. We'll go to the glands for that. The thymus gland is really amazing for that. It's very well studied. And in fact, for people that are sick, they're often prescribed a prescription form of thymic protein A. So that can be really beneficial. Now, it's becoming a bit easier now to get some of the more obscure things. I used to have to like really become close friends with someone who owned cattle or other animals to be able to get things like the adrenal gland, the hypothalamus, the thyroid, some of the smaller glands. But those are real powerful when needed, when someone really needs those. So those can be very good. But in general, I start mixing it into the ground meat because most people are kind of intimidated and afraid and not into the flavor. And once they start to get used to it, we don't have to do as much prep. For instance, if someone is just starting with liver, we'll usually bread the liver. We'll use Parmesan or something else to bread it with. And then cook it in tons of fat and onions and all these flavors, right? And then once they get used to it, they don't need any of that. And so it becomes much easier to consume and to prepare and all of that.
And how do you feel about organs and otherwise cooking methods and different nutrition? So I've heard of different people consuming organs raw. We have capsule form. You mentioned here, breading and cooking up liver, putting it in ground beef or ground meat, which is going to be cooked. How does that change things when you start to cook it?
Oh, that's a great question. So every region that I go to prepares the organs a little bit differently very often. Some will do more raw, some will do more cooked, and it often depends on which one. Like the liver is most often raw. I can't think of a time where I've seen it cooked. That one is raw. Often the kidneys are raw as well, but things like the lungs tend to be cooked, the brain tends to be cooked, a very short poaching for things that are kind of gelatinous like that, like soft. So the brain, the lungs, those get a quick poaching or a quick cook over the fire, but not cooked as long as the meat. So it's not chewy and dry and flavorless. So the cooking method really affects the flavor and how you're going to like it. I mean, very drastically so, especially if you haven't been raised with it. But most of these communities that I go to really do those things quite right. They just do light cooking. With things like fish liver, so in Greece, you can get monkfish liver, which is one of my favorite foods, and it's a hard one to get. And that you just sear it on each side very lightly, very quickly, like an ahi tuna. You can also eat that raw, but it's so delectable when you sear it. So that's a really good way to go. There are a few regions that will put it kind of all in together as a soup, but those tend to be regions where they already ate when they caught the animal or they slaughtered the animal, and so they're not eating it fresh. And they do one-pot cooking methods. I think so often we're very intimidated when we go from maybe living a kind of modern American life or modern wherever you're from life. And then we get sick and we suddenly realize, oh, I have to learn how to do this and I need to cook from scratch and all these kinds of things. But what I've really taken away from all of my travels is that you really only need one pot and a knife. If you have a pot and a knife, you can eat like traditional folks. So they cook very simply and very easily, but it's very tasty. And so, I personally went from just having the most extensive, fabulous kitchen. I do miss that kitchen, to now I feel great as long as I have some place to heat up a pot. I can cook really good food. So you start to learn that it doesn't have to take over your whole life to do many of these diets and make these changes. It's actually about doing less than doing more.
So you talked about the fish liver that you really enjoy. You mentioned brain and a whole bunch of different organs. In your travels with these different communities, what are some of the more unique organs and parts of the animal that you've tried?
Oh, that's a great question. Okay, I mean, definitely my last trip to Japan. This is not in Okinawa. This is after Okinawa in mainland Japan. Eating fallopian tubes that had fertilized eggs. That was fascinating. It was fascinating. And surprisingly, really good, really good. I would say the feet. That's definitely something. Feet is pretty common throughout Europe, so like chicken feet or other animals' feet. But I don't see Americans going for that, and I usually see them kind of shy away from it. But that is something that children and their mothers will fight over. Is the foot. Like the mothers will be like, no, 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 you don't get that. That is for me, because they all love it so much. So that would be a little bit different as well. The eyes tend to be very prized, and also all of the kind of messy bits. So when we go to a butcher, there's usually like you've got your steak, you've got your fat rendered over here. Everything's very separate. The bones for marrow are clean on the outside, right? All of those bits that would usually be attached to the bone, they're some of the most flavorful. They're some of the best for fixing collagen issues, and those are very, very loved. So when I go to these regions, when someone eats, the bones are clean at the end. There's nothing remaining, and that would be, I would say, a big difference. The most unique thing I ever ate, though, aside from the fallopian tubes, would be in Greenland, and that was with the raw fermented ox, AUK. An auk is a tiny little bird, and they catch the large amounts. They'll catch thousands at a time, and then when they're dead, they will also catch a seal and carve out the inside of the seal, basically take out the inner organs. Then they stuff the seal with the little birds, and the little birds still have their feathers on. Now the birds are dead at this stage, right? So it's usually about 100 birds in a stomach, but of course it depends on the size of the seal. And then they stitch it up and they bury it in the snow, and it ferments for a year. When they go to open it up, and this is a celebratory food, so this isn't something that you eat all the time, it's something that's for celebrations like weddings or other celebrations. So they open up the seal belly, and the birds have almost liquefied. So they still have their feathers on there, but they've almost liquefied. I had read about this dish for over 2 decades. And I didn't know if I would ever consume it, because there are several explorers that died consuming this food. They got botulism. Now the locals, they don't get any problem with it because they have a good microbiome. And so it only is benefited by this food. But I did think I would have to use my very polite face and as much grace as I could muster while I consumed it. I was not expecting this to taste good. But I was shocked. It was delectable. The meat, because it had kind of liquefied, it melted in your mouth like the best French duck. Like if a 5-star, higher than 5-star restaurant would produce for you. So it was really good. And you could see why all the old ladies love to go after it and pick off the feathers.
That's fascinating. And you mentioned, being a couple decades, you'd known about this delicacy. How much research do you do before you go to an area like Greenland? Have an idea of different, experiences you want to have and foods you want to try?
Oh, great question. So in general, I tend to do an enormous amount of research over many years, but I also, what I research really is just there to posit questions for when I'm there, because I find that most of what I've read and most of what's written in the books, whether they're anthropological or observational, someone telling a biography of having visited that region, or more scientific, it's usually off base by quite a bit. And the deeper I get to know the culture, the more I get there. So I'll do the research so that I can see what plants, what animals are in the region. I can ask pointed questions and see about that. But usually the bulk of my learning happens on the ground, I would say.
And what are your goals when you go to an area like that? How much of it is for your own life experience and knowledge? And how much of it is to, share with the masses and have a bigger impact?
Well, I would say I am insatiably curious because it has been so fascinating to see so many populations in extremely perfect health. And so I've really just had this hunger to learn. And that would be really what's driving me most. And also why I think I've been successful in getting those relationships and getting to spend time in those regions, because these cultures operate very different than us. They don't have time like we do, or these schedules. In fact, many of them, and each one is different. But to give you an example, in many of the Arctic regions, not all, but many of the communities that I've stayed with, breaking your promise is a good thing. So if they say to you, yeah, I'm going to take you to this town on this day, and then it becomes that day, what is important to them is authenticity. That's what's prized. So they don't think anything of breaking a contract or backing out of something they had agreed to do. So you could show up and they may not come for 2 more weeks to take you to where it is. And so if you come with a real agenda to these regions, you would get angry and frustrated and stressed. You kind of have to go, experience, and then take the gems that you learn and go from there. So that's typically what I'm doing. Now, there are times like when I've been hired by film crews or something like that, where I have to get certain things, and that is stressful. Yes, that is different. But when I go, no, it's less so. It is something that I really want to bring to the public. So I'm kind of starting, we'll see if it happens, but I think I'm wrapping up some of my travels so that I can make this digestible for you all, because it would really change the trajectory of my life when I read about some of these communities. And these books were written in the 1800s. And as I went and saw some of these communities, I felt like now everything is kind of not taken seriously, right? You read something and you're like, well, maybe, right? But if you actually see something with your own eyes, that's very impactful. And so I've been taking video of the places I've gone and videoed the interviews and the people and that kind of thing when I can. There are times, like there was many times just in the last month when I was driving around to the Sami cultures, where I didn't even take out my camera or ask, because there's so many political things going on that I didn't want to put them in a bad position. So it takes me a long time before I'll bring a camera out. But in the meantime, while I'm kind of building the relationships, I'm really learning quite a bit. And I also get the benefit of getting to live in that way for a short period of time, which is delightful.
As you're traveling around and having these experiences, do you run into other people that are doing a similar thing? Because from my perspective, it seems like what you're doing here is very unique. We talked about you've been to all the blue zones, and it seems like every time I hear you, talk on an interview, I'm hearing about different places you visited and these experiences. How many people out there have lived a similar type of life, in your opinion, and had these kind of experiences and this travel experience like you've had?
Oh, I don't know, but I do see people out, but not in most of the end regions that I go to. And I'll see people that are curious about the culture, going on a cultural vacation, that go to some of the closer communities, that you can get to within a matter of days. Kind of thing, but I don't see anyone going with a purpose. Now, there's some footprints from people that have gone before me. So sometimes I'll see a structure that was built by some anthropologist or someone that was in the region to survey something. Many of these regions, there's been a lot of mining, sometimes as far back as the 17 or 1800s, where foreigners came in for a short period of time and then left, and they'll sometimes leave a footprint. So there's some of that. But I haven't really seen people going out and trying to learn from them so much, or with the same motivation, I would say. And yeah, yeah, I do bring people on my trips sometimes. So some of my friends have come, my colleagues have come. But yeah, no, not really. No. In fact, even the communities think I'm very strange for wanting to come in, and also for the things that I'll want to do, like go for hunts, because at least as far as I've seen in all the communities on all the continents that have people, the women don't hunt, and so they think it's very strange that I would like to come. But they tend to let me go as often as I'd like, so that's very nice. They're very gracious about that.
Well, a layer to this that is so incredible is the fact that you're not just doing it in one area. You're continuing to do this in all different areas of the world and in different climates. You mentioned the Sami, we talked about Greenland. You've been all over.
Yeah.
So that's to me such a layer to all this. The fact that you have this diversity to your travel experience that seems like it has to be very rare.
I think it's really important. I've really been doing that on purpose because it's so often that someone goes to a region, and I mean, this happened with the blue zones for a short period of time, thinks that they know a lot, and then leaves, and then tells the world that they should all eat that way. And and I knew from my upbringing, and also from a number of other things, that it's very clear from history that humans can be in peak health, a level that we can't imagine, on many different diets. But those diets have things in common. And so when I really saw a lot of the fighting or the butting up against of other practitioners or other influencers around certain diets, right? Like this is the vegan camp, and this is the paleo camp, and this is the keto camp, and this is the carnivore, and then there's divisions within them all, and they all think low of each other. And from the onset of my practice, I taught over 41 different diets. The main thread was that they had to be ancestral, and then you cater them based on the person's need and the very specific needs of the condition. And so you certainly don't need it to be that complicated. Don't all feel like you have to go out and learn 41 different methods. You don't, but at all. But I really, I see this incredible epidemic of illness, mental and physical, and it's heartbreaking. I go to these regions and I know what's coming for them because they're going to lose their health very quickly. Really in this generation, it's going to go downhill. And we're so far beyond that it's almost past a tipping point, right? If we were in a world war right now, there couldn't be proper recruitments. That's how unhealthy our boys and men are. And women are far less healthy than the boys and men, just by the nature of the hormones fluctuating and the issues that you can have there. So in this environment. And so I see all of this, and I think really the more important thing is not who's helping get the education out there or the knowledge out there, but that people can see real practical applications of these different things and see why certain people promote different protocols and why it works for certain people at certain stages of life and illness and all of that. And so that's really been a large part of my focus, was to show how different the protocols are, or the diets are, in different regions, and what benefits you might get from those.
Say you're working with somebody, say up in Russia, versus somebody suffering from the same mental or physical challenge down in Mexico. How much of that diet will be based around the location that person's living in
It's a good question.
versus,
Yeah.
we talked about organ meats before, and it sounds like that would be a piece of any healing diet, but how much of it would be a certain template that you would go by, and how much of it would be based on the location that person that's doing the healing is living in?
Often when I get someone, and I should preface by saying that I tend to work with very disabled people that have been sick for a long time. So I'm not getting someone who's just like overweight, right? Or a mild condition. But with the really severe ones, we often ignore the location for the most part, because we have we have to work quickly with the microbiome and to regenerate things. So it's often a more very restrictive. I don't think it's restrictive. It's like pulling the arrow back, right? It's disciplined. You have to be very disciplined, but it's not a permanent diet. So I really work on getting people flexible. And once they're in remission and they can eat other foods and not have reactions, that's when we do more the location based, like extremely so, because then you can do more of certain plants or this and that, and you can go more on preference if you're doing things right. And so we'll do more of that. If someone goes into remission and they're living in, say, Mexico, I'm much more comfortable with them doing the 5-stage corn once they're in remission than someone in Norway. No, No corn. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. Maybe for a holiday if it's like really important to you, but otherwise, no. So it tends to be used, I use that more once someone gets into remission and as they're getting into remission. That said, it does really help when I have someone in kind of the more unique regions. So I've worked with a lot of people who work up in the northern parts of Sweden and Finland and Norway. And the foods that they can just so easily get are fabulous for healing and also what they've been raised on. So it's not a big hurdle for them to start eating whole real food in the traditional way because it's still a major part of their diet. It's just not been their whole diet. And so that can be really fun. I would certainly cater some of the lifestyle things. So right now we're in the polar night in the Arctic. So for that, you need a lot of candlelight or fireplace light. That red light is really important for the microbiome and for your circadian rhythm when you don't have a lot of sunlight. So those kind of things I do cater.
Talk more about the microbiome piece. You've touched on it a couple times when it came to light and back when you're talking about diet. How do you look at that and how do you look at other inputs that have a direct impact on the microbiome?
Well, the microbiome is, I really think, a huge key to getting out of illness. And it's wildly misunderstood, understandably so. It's very complex. But, uh, but our microbiome is constantly in communication with the world. So if you and I were sitting in a room together, we would actually be sharing microbes. If you snuggle with your wife at night, you're sharing microbes. And we're constantly in this interchange. But these bacteria need food. And there's three main families within the bacterial microbiome. There's a virome as well, which is actually larger than the microbiome. It's 37,000 times bigger, and we know very little about it. But with the three families of bacteria, there's trillions underneath that. And the good bacteria that we're always talking about, that is like your easygoing friend. You know, they are just happy wherever they are. They'll eat anything. They'll eat carbs, fat, protein. They're happy. They're easy. Your overgrowths, which are related to, definitely correlated, if not causative, to most of the chronic illnesses, the long-term illnesses, those can only eat starch and sugar. Same with the pathogenic bacteria. And so if you're dealing with a pathogenic bacteria or a chronic illness, you pull the starch and sugar out. Your good bacteria have the protein and the fat, and you're good to go. And then it readjusts, and later you can do the starch and not be sick. So it's always in flux, but it does so much for us. Most of what we think we do, the microbiome does, down to the way it communicates with light, the way it gets moved by light exposure as much as by diet. So many people will think, okay, well, I'm on a really strict diet, so if this doesn't work, I'm not going to get better. But the reality is our microbiome is very affected by our environment and by light and all sorts of things. So there's other things that come into it. But these guys, they do so much for us, right? They eat our lactic acid. They prevent infections. So for instance, foodborne infections in the States are problematic, right? They're usually found Salmonella, E. coli, usually on salads. That's the predominant. Over 95% each year is from raw vegetables. That's where you're getting it. The beneficial E. coli prevents that from happening. So if you have your good E. coli, which almost no one does now because of antibiotics, but if you have that, then when you get exposed to pathogenic E. coli, the good E. coli would be like your white knight coming up on the horse and just banishing it from the lands. So there's a lot to the microbiome that before we messed with it was pretty perfect, right? But you know, it's deeply involved in our feel-good chemicals. And I see a lot of people miss the mark on this. They tend to think that the microbiome is just your gut, which just your gut, it's huge, but it's not. It's all over our eyes and our skin. It's our entire body, right? We're actually more bacteria than we are human by far. And we're constantly discovering new things about it, like L-form bacteria, which was probably a huge mistake that we made in the past. And you know, of course we did. It's how we learn medically. But in general, when we take an antibiotic, very rarely kills the bacteria. It changes its form to an L form, which promotes chronic disease. So there's all these things that are in flux with the microbiome, and where it's just very fascinating.
And for somebody that has neglected it over a lifetime and taken antibiotics, whether they were needed or not, and, ate a lot of processed foods and lived a high stress, bad lighting lifestyle like a lot of people have, how much hope do we have for rebuilding that later in life?
A ton, a ton. So there are a few microbes that you only get from your mother. And so if you lose those, you lose those. But that is not a deal breaker for your health or your life. You can have a very healthy life, even if you've been on antibiotics for years. The thing is that it's a real commitment, because with the microbiome, even a tiny bit of starch, like a little bit in a supplement, can keep a microbe alive for 2 years once. Like, you have that one bit of starch, and for 2 years that microbe can stay alive. And so it takes an incredible amount, a really Herculean amount of discipline to do the protocols that shift the microbiome. And you can't really rely on testing. A lot of times people will say, oh, I did this stool test, it's fine, or I just don't have enough diversity. But that's your colon. That tells you nothing about the rest of the body. So if you're chronically ill, you can just bank on, yes, the microbiome needs help. And then you want to avoid, as much as you can, doing the other things. So a lot of times people will ask me about, should I take antibiotics or not? And legally, I can't tell anyone. But what I would do is only use them in life-threatening situations. So if you have sepsis, pneumonia, yes. Sinus infection, no. Right? So those kind of things. If it's life-threatening, yes. Otherwise, no, because the cost is high. It is absolutely high, and you can't just take a probiotic to make up for it.
We'll talk more about that. I wanted to get into probiotics, fermented foods. These are the low-hanging fruit in the health and wellness space when it comes to the microbiome, specifically the gut. How do you look at those?
Well, some are really amazing, and some I'm waiting to hit the market. So, for instance, there's oxalobacter bacteria, which really helps people break down oxalates. Most of us don't have it, not just from antibiotics, but also because these little bacteria, when they're overfed, so let's say you've eaten a spinach salad every day for a year, they would explode. They actually explode. Little like combustions. And so some of the bacteria end up getting overfed with our modern diets. And that is one, the oxalobacter bacteria, that's one that you get from your mother. So we don't have it in capsules yet, but hopefully soon. And maybe while I've been out of Wi-Fi, maybe it's come out. But in general, the probiotics all work together to do different things. And some that are really wonderful for one thing can cause an issue if you have another condition. So for instance, let's say you want to get your collagen improved, right? No bacteria, at least that we've studied, improves collagen better than Ruddick. Ruddick is like magic. Like if any of you all are back home drinking your collagen, let me just tell you, you will feel like Wonder Woman or man if you have Ruddick yogurt. It really accelerates the collagen properly, but it's high histamine. So if you also have histamine issues, MCAD, it could be contraindicated, right? And so we're going to the reductionist view again with these microbes, but in reality, they work together to do different things. So there are certain ones that I'll use. I love the beneficial E. coli, sometimes like a plantarum to lower the histamines, really great. But in general, the bacteria can become good or bad depending on its environment. And so some of the studies that have been done in Brazil, actually, with Alzheimer's and certain kinds of parasites, have found that people living on a traditional diet in the jungle, in their traditional way, they could have the same parasite that causes us grave harm, and for them, it actually gives them beneficial benefits. And that's not too surprising the deeper you look into the microbiome, because you and I, right now, I would be shocked if we don't have tuberculosis in us right now, but we're not sick, right? It's actually doing good things for us. So a lot of these, when they overgrow, they go from the small amount that's needed to a large amount. That's when they can cause problems. And when we tinker directly with the microbiome using isolated ones, it could potentially throw some things off, but most of the ones on the market are not too harmful. I would say for anyone going out there buying, just like your acetophilus or something like that, look into where they go because different bacteria belong in different areas. Acetophilus, amazing for the skin. And that's where it's really needed. The vaginal canal is very good too, although there's many others like Casey that belongs there. In the sinuses, for most people who have allergies or sinus infections, that's Sakai, right? And that's very rich in Korean ferments. So no surprise that there's not really food allergies in Korea. They have the lowest of all the countries. Because that really, it keeps it down. So there are pointed ways to use them. And I would say we need to use them a lot more than we're doing. Because when I go to the traditional cultures, they use them on their whole body. It's not just in their diet, right? So they'll be using yogurt on their skin every day or washing their hair with yogurt. The fermentations are more infused into the life and less a big lump on the plate.
Well, as you were talking before about the fact that we share a microbiome with people that we're in contact with, in the same room, cuddling with, it gets me thinking back to your unique experience traveling the world and being with all different types of people with different microbiomes, different environments, eating different foods. You must have a very unique microbiome.
I would imagine so. Yeah, I feel like I have a really good one, like really good, because wherever I go, I'm not getting the foodborne illnesses or the water illnesses, the things that other people definitely bring home with them. So knock on wood, yeah, I feel like mine is very, very good. Yes.
Let's talk about more into your travels and some of the remote areas you've been to. What's the farthest off the grid you've been?
Oh, well, there's been several places I've been that take, 2 weeks to get to from the time you get close to the region. But you have to take lots of different commuter planes and things like that. Papua New Guinea would definitely be one. I went to several regions in Papua New Guinea. The Greenland, definitely, because you go by dog sled to many places and it takes so many days once you land in Greenland to get to the regions that you want to go to. Um, Definitely part of this last trip that I just went on, and then any trip to the Amazon because you have to go so far in to really get away from civilization, and typically very dangerous. You basically have to bribe people to take you because it's so dangerous. And so you'll be on a road that they are building in front of you, like they're cutting it out of the mountain, and waterfalls are constantly washing it away, and you can't hire a pilot to get you in there. So I would say maybe the Amazon actually of all of them, because that when I've been there, and it's to the regions that I'm going. I'm sure that's not the case for all Amazon trips, but there's not even radio communication. And so if you get into a pickle, you're in a pickle. There's no one coming to help you at all. Yeah, I would say that would probably be it, because also the modes of transportation, you have to hop on and off many different things. So, you'll be on a long drive and then boats and then boats and then boats and then boats. And that's after taking a plane before the drive. So probably that one. Mhm.
As I'm picturing the Amazon, I'm picturing so much trust when you talked about safety with, the people that you're associating with, the wildlife out there, the environment, the harsh environment that, us over here in the West aren't used to. Is it a really humbling experience to disconnect? Like you said, no radio, obviously no Wi-Fi. What is that feeling like? Because a lot of us have never been there and will never be there.
Yes. What's funny is that you can come with your kind of cultural imprint of, okay, there's these infections in the region, and these are the deadly snakes and the deadly insects, and be mindful of these. But honestly, as soon as you get there and you see a whole community sitting on the dirt, laughing, having fun, being so healthy, all that goes away, and you're just very present. I would say the feeling that I get when I'm with these communities is that of a conscious meditation. Kind of like if you've spent much time, if you're a dog person, you'll notice that dogs are very present and you just feel good around them. Well, whenever I'm in these communities, they're not as lost in their thoughts. They're very present and they're very open and warm. And the children are as well. And so there's a lot of laughter, sincerity, deep connections rather quickly, and a lot of eye contact, things that just make you feel very relaxed as a human, not just on a perceptible level, but also on a nervous system level, right? Your HRV starts going up whenever you're around this many people that are calm and happy. And so in general, it's a very lovely feeling. Now, reality can check in, and there are times where, where it has been serious. So for instance, when my dog sled almost fell through the ice in the Arctic twice because it was starting to melt and change seasons, that was significant. Or really, I would say in the Amazon, got into some serious trouble many times, especially going through towns where there's drug trades and things like that. And I mean, you're talking you're 8 days into the forest. You don't expect to run into trouble, but you really can. And then you're very much at the mercy of luck, your social graces, acting like an idiot. Basically, you have to act like an idiot and pretend like you have nothing valuable, which you should never bring valuable things into any of these regions. but that's you. And then also whoever brought you, how good they are at navigating that, to prevent like kidnappings and things like that. So there's definitely that. But I was the most humbled this last year. I had my scariest, I would say, trip this year, and that was in Ethiopia, in the Omo Valley, which in general, Ethiopia is much more safe than a lot of the countries I go to in a lot of the African countries. You can have your windows down in your car. You don't have to guard things all the time. You can have a phone. Mostly Sega, you can't have your phone out. So that's not a problem. But they were tipping back into another civil war and tribal warfare. And so, cell towers were going down, airports were closing, it was getting really bad. People were marching on the streets with machetes, like 40 grown men. It was really not good. So that was very humbling, I would say. And that was definitely one of those moments where I was like, what am I doing?
And how does your family and friends react when you're going to go to a remote area? I'm sure they get used to it to a point, but you'd never become totally used to it. Are they encouraging, or how do they feel?
Well, I think now, because it's been so many years and so many trips, just countless trips, that Mom just doesn't want to know too much, just that I'm home safe and wants to hear from me regularly when I can. Dad thinks it's great. He loves it. I think he's living vicariously. But I do really stay very close in contact with him. I'll tell him if there's any trouble. I'll always connect to the embassy and that kind of thing. So I do cross my T's. But no, I think in general, they would prefer I not. But they also know that they don't have much sway in that area. The first time I went out, Mom was terrified. I would say most of my family and friends were terrified because I had been so sick before, and I was going into these regions where there was, just horrific, deadly illnesses, and so they were like, "What are you doing? Why would you go here after all of that?" But after so many, everyone gets a little numb and they just kind of nod. Mm-hmm.
In your deepest travels to the remote areas, do you feel like you've been to an area that what the people of the West haven't been to previously? Have you gotten that deep in?
I have.
Where was that?
Yeah, I've been to many on almost every continent. Yeah, there's
Obviously there's, indigenous people there, I'm assuming. Maybe
yes,
not, but
yes,
people from the West, areas that we haven't actually been.
yes, because many of the places I'm going are they're not valuable to the West, right? And so the places that were valuable already had people coming. And as that happened, the indigenous got pushed off to other lands. And so they're often on land that maybe we wouldn't deem valuable right now. That always changes by the decade and what's found and all of that. But because of that, definitely, I've been to many places where there haven't been encroachment. Now, that is changing drastically. So what you would have, even in many of these zones, would be governmental schools that were self-run by the locals, but the government mandated that they have schools. So you didn't have people coming in from the outside, but you had this. And what changed recently, and why I'm saying that this is not going to be the case for long, if it's even remaining now, is that a lot of nonprofits came into these schools during COVID and gave everyone cell phones. And so that's when a lot of these regions had that. But some of these regions are really hiding. It's why it can take so long to get into them and to build trust, and why I don't always bring out a camera. It's because, or I don't until later, or a second trip. It's because they're really in hiding because they're trying to keep a semblance of their culture alive. And in almost, if not all the places I've been, it's really quite illegal to live in the traditional way. So like with the Sami in Sweden, they're not allowed to have their houses. They have to have a house like us, right? And in most of the communities that I went to throughout Latin and South America, they aren't allowed to be seen in their traditional clothing. So if they go for a long hunt and run into people, they can get jailed or killed. All sorts of things can happen. And so they're going more and more remote. And some of them so far remote that, the books would say these people have died out when they haven't. But we'll see how long that lasts for, I would say.
And do you feel like there's people, I should say, in areas, say, in South America, that are so deep within the jungle that they haven't even had contact with other humans?
Oh, yes, there are. So, for instance, one of my trips to the Amazon, the area that I was going to are known to be pretty peaceful. So they're small subsistence farmers, and they live about 30 minutes away from each other. It's very sweet. On the other side of the river, there's a group that's hunter-gatherer. And if you all watch or read National Geographic had this amazing photo taken from a helicopter of someone with a bow and arrow trying to shoot them down. And this wasn't that long ago. This is that group, and they are very untouched. And part of it is because they shoot before asking. So you can't get close. Even my friends that I was going to visit, they can't get close either. So there are some of those groups. There's not many, but there are some. There's some island groups like that as well, and they tend to be very aggressive towards outsiders. Now, they may not be actual aggressive cultures, but I think it's a pretty rational response when so much harm has happened, when people have come. And so it could just be very simply like, stay away. This is our land. And if something comes, they shoot. But yeah, there's about 5 or 6 that I can think of off the top of my head that have had zero touching from the outside. It doesn't say that they're not affected, though, because they've often, again, been pushed to regions, or there's been something that happened in that region. So, for instance, with the hunter-gatherer group that I just mentioned in the Amazon, they had illegal mining in that area in the 1800s. So there's a lot of heavy metals in the water and in the soil, and that can cause health issues. So I don't know if I'd find the pristine health with that group or not, but we may never know, to be honest. It's very difficult to get in with them, get anywhere close. And I don't know if you want to. I don't think you'd survive.
So the examples you gave there's been awareness, at least, of people of the West. But that would lead us to believe even deeper in, there'd be a good chance there would be people that have never even seen another human from the West.
Oh, yes. Yes, definitely. Mm-hmm.
What about some of the animal encounters when you're
Oh,
deep
those are
in the
fun.
remote areas? What are some of the different animals you've seen, and scary and not scary, beautiful encounters you've had?
Okay, that's a really good question, and one no one's asked before. I really like that. I would say I'm the most afraid of the snakes. I don't have a snake fear like Indiana Jones, but they're just something that they're very hard to defend against, and they really are all over the place and very deadly. So, so those have been really interesting because they'll just go right in front of you, like a fleur-de-lance will go right in front of you, or a black mamba, like 6 inches from your foot, but you're okay. And so you're like, whew, okay. And everyone else is walking around barefoot and they're not bothered. So you just kind of keep going. I've been charged by a lot of animals, like a lot. Lions, rhinos, all sorts of things multiple times. And it's given me a whole new theory on health, actually. So there's a woman I've been reading who is talking about how in times of stress, we've always said that we go to flight or fight, right? That's what's the dialogue in chronic illness and all these things. Well, actually, women, people that are born a female, they go to community. They actually go to share and to help and support. It's a very different system in the body. It's very interesting. And and that, along with my experience of being charged by so many animals, it feels amazing. It's a chemical release that I haven't gotten with anything else. When you survive it, of course, that's obviously very important. But it is always really exciting because it adds to the adventure, and you know going in that it's dangerous. You know there may be a lot of crocodiles or certain kinds of animals in that region, and so it's always important to learn from the people who live there what to do in those situations. They know so much more than we do. So even, for instance, take a snake, if it's especially a ground snake, if it's on a path and there's no grass on that path, you have the advantage. It can't go very fast. But if it's in the grass, it can go faster than light. At least that's what it seems like. I'm exaggerating, but it goes so fast. And so your placement is very important. It's also important to know the cycle of that animal, when it tends to be active, what it's afraid of. So, you know, a lot of antelope have dots on the back of their hide. It's meant to look like eyes, right? So many of the attacking cats don't tend to attack if they have eye contact with the prey. And so things like that can be very helpful to know to look for, and also just to be a bit more protective. But yeah, I would say probably my most unique was I've spent the night with a couple different very aggressive cats by accident, and those would probably be the most adventurous that I've had. But yeah, there's just endless. Honestly, there's really endless experiences when it comes down to the animals.
What is that feeling like when you come back to Ohio, come back to the US after always having, being on edge in a way when you're out in the wild? You mentioned big cats and crocodiles. What is life like coming back over to the US after an experience like that?
In some ways delicious, like really delicious, because because it's so nice to have a shower. You don't get dirty the way we think of it when you're out there. You don't tend to get smelly, but it just feels really good to have modern things that you're used to, that you were raised with, right? Or, oh my gosh, if I go to America or Dubai Dubai is one of my favorite places to go after a trip because it's just like ultra convenient. So you can get anything. Did your camera die? You're fine. You can get any of 10,000. Do you want ketogenic tacos shipped to your door in 5 minutes? Done. Like you can get whatever you want. It's amazing. And so I actually really like that contrast quite a bit. Yeah, I really love it. I do think that if I wasn't traveling as often to these communities, it could be sad that I don't get to see the people and have that kind of communion and community. Maybe that would be sad, but so far it hasn't been sad. It's been more joyful, and then I'm very excited to eat a little food variety. Usually when I get into the cities, so that's always been really good too.
Talk about the attachment piece because you're traveling to all these different areas, you're experiencing different environments that are radically different, all kinds of people. Do you ever become attached to the people, a specific region? whether it be super remote or not. And because that would be so in direct opposition to the way you live, traveling around and being all over the place, do you ever get pulled to just staying somewhere because of either the people or the environment?
Oh, I think I would if I didn't have such a close group of friends and my family. I'm really close with people that I grew up with and also with my family. So I think if I didn't have that foundation, yes, definitely. And certain people just really touch your heart in a very deep way. And so I don't tend to think in permanence, like, oh, I won't be back or that kind of thing. I tend to assume that I will, but certain people just shine a little brighter, and I definitely miss them. I would say one of the hardest things to balance is staying in connection with many of them or with my connections to those regions, because everywhere I've traveled, I've made so many friends. And so my WhatsApp and my international communication channels are flooded with people that I love, like every single person I adore. And so how do you communicate all the time? Because in most of these places, it's a daily communication. So it would be a very full-time job, just that keeping that alone. But so far they've been very graceful with me. They've been very kind about about my infrequent pop-ins to check in on how they are doing, and my apologies for not answering sooner. So I would say that would be the most difficult part. There are places where I'd like to go for a period, like the Kazakh eagle hunters in Mongolia, staying in the gur, or we would call it like a yurt or a tent, with especially the last family I stayed with. I just want to go and stay for a few months and write a book. It's so pleasant and beautiful and peaceful. You sleep by fire. You eat wonderful food. There's lovely music. You're in the middle of the mountains with snow leopards and tons of snow. It's stunning. So, and it's very peaceful. You feel very rested there. So that would be a place I'd really like to go and spend a good amount of time.
From all your travels, what are some of the profound ways that you're different as a person, whether it be the way you eat, your lifestyle, specific examples of different places that have changed you, where when you come back to the US, people will maybe even take notice, like you're different in this way, Mary. You've evolved.
Yeah. We'd have to ask them, really. We'd have to ask my friends. But I think uh, I would say the biggest is that I've become very, very flexible. I was always an easygoing person, but flexible with cultural things is very different, right? We tend to want our standards, our comforts, these kind of things. And even just not going into indigenous lands, let's just say like when I moved to Europe, it was such an adjustment to have a tiny bathroom and to not have counters in the bathroom and kitchens being so tiny, right? So especially coming from like a real cooking background, it was a real hurdle to get over. So things like that, I feel very flexible with. One thing that has definitely changed is that I don't have all the things to bring with me. So a lot of times if someone is going on one of these trips, it's their first time, they will prepare for a year, right? And they'll have all these things. And I kind of just go. I might have some backup herbs or something for the major infections, especially if I'm bringing a film crew. But otherwise, it's easy. I bring less. And so I would say that would be one of the biggest things. The other thing is how I pack. Really, I mean, I pack very differently than when I first started all of this. I choose clothing differently as well, uh, and I don't buy kind of anything. So in the communities, if I buy some of the artworks and things, it's really to build the relationship, to show appreciation for their craft, that kind of thing. But because I do travel so much, I don't tend to accumulate things. So I don't like bring things from the trips unless they're really special. And that's very rare. So yeah.
Earlier, you quickly touched on your health challenge you had earlier in life, and I want to take some time and get into that story. So I'll take things all the way back to college. You're 18 years old, you're in the Bahamas, and you get sick. Talk about what happened there and how that changed everything.
Oh yeah, completely changed my life. Yes, for the better, I would say, but not for the first 12 years. So I was studying to be marine biology at a field station in the Bahamas, and it was rustic. The island didn't have cars and modern amenities, so it was a bit like camping. Lovely, very long days. And one day, about half of us students got very, very sick, high fevers. But you're a kid. So for me, I thought it was just like a flu. I grew up as a healthy kid. Sometimes you get a flu and then you're fine a few days later. So I wasn't worried about it. In fact, it was a nice little respite because we had been so active and we hadn't had any days off in so long. But my fever was higher than the others. And with some of these tropical infections, the healthier you are, actually the worse you can get. So I may have been in that camp. But my fever went to 106 and stayed there for 6 days. They ended up care flighting myself and another, but a lot of the damage to my nervous system was already done, especially to the hypothalamus and the pituitary. And so I assumed it would be like mono, and I would recover maybe slowly, but I would recover. And quite the opposite happened. It got worse and worse and worse. And so I spent the better part of 12 years very disabled, many of those years fully in bed. And it unfortunately, because the hypothalamus was involved in the nervous system, it deregulated everything that you don't think about. So your circulation, how your immune system functions, your body temperature. And I don't mean in a mild way. The body temperature could go from 96.7 to 103.5, back down, up and down, up and down. And so it really wears the body out, and you lack energy on a very foundational level, not like being tired from working. It's a very different kind of lack of energy to where you can't pick things up. And so ended up very, very disabled, lots of organ damage, severe kidney disease, liver, thyroid, 2 forms of autoimmune thyroid, a few different autoimmune diseases, and severe neuropathy, which was perhaps the worst because it's so incredibly painful and unrelenting. And because I grew up in a pretty scientific family and a very Western medicine area. We did Western medicine for years and years and years. And I really had some wonderful doctors through those years, some very caring doctors, but they didn't know what to do. And when they did find out what I had, which was dysautonomia, which is an umbrella term, there's many different forms, and there's severe and light, and mine was severe. But it was a relief to know what it was that was causing the organ damage and the nerve damage, but there wasn't a real solution. And so between all the medication and the breathing machine, it was very clear where I was going pretty quickly. I had lost about 40 pounds from where I am now, so I looked like a real skeleton, and things weren't going well. So eventually, I think it was about 7 years in or so, I was obviously living at my parents' house. I couldn't take care of myself. And we just kind of had a powwow. And we decided to try something different because there didn't seem to be much time left. And what we were doing wasn't working. I was getting much worse. And so I decided I wanted to get off a lot of the medicines, which was a little scary, but I did. And they were very supportive of that. And we did it responsibly. We talked to the medical team to see how and how to do that. And at the same time, we started looking in other areas. At the time, I had really written off things like supplements and things like that because I felt like, well, if these things worked, my doctor would know. And I was a bit arrogant about it. And then also, I already ate healthier than my friends. I grew up eating healthier than them. My family doesn't eat great with what I know now, but they ate so much better than the general American. And then as an athlete, I really refined that. And then as I got sick, I refined it even more. So, I was vegetarian for years and then vegan, and I thought I was doing everything right. So we didn't look at diet right away. And during those years that I was bedbound in their house, when we decided to pivot, I started going back into some of the anthropological books that I had read growing up, specifically the medical anthropological books from the 1800s by doctors. And you know how it is when you read something from a different point in your life, you see it in a different way. And what I saw reading it from this sphere of disability was that these communities, these indigenous populations that these doctors were going to visit, they were in pristine health. They didn't even get cavities, nothing. And and that was so shocking to me. And they were eating the exact opposite of what we had all been told to eat and what I was eating. And so that alone helped me to shift out of my mindset of like, what I'm doing is good, to, okay, maybe we don't know anything and let's turn this upside down. If these people, I was reading about the Maasai specifically, they were the first ones. They only consume blood, milk, and meat in the traditional context, and red meat, right? Which this was still, this was a long time ago. This is 20 years ago. So red meat was still very poo-pooed. And I was just shocked by that. And I was like, well, if these are their only foods and they're in perfect health, there's not a possibility in the world that those foods aren't healthy for humans, right? If they were, they wouldn't have generational health. So they'd be gone. They would have died already. So I flipped it. I brought in meat immediately and started learning a lot, learned about Weston A. Price Foundation and the traditional diets there, and refined, did about 17 different diets, much more after that, but before. And then stumbled upon a traditional Russian diet called the GAPS diet that Dr. Natasha McBride had put together and kind of advanced, and ended up going on that, which was very simple. I basically ate the same bowl of soup every day for every meal for 2 years. There's 100 different ways to do the GAPS diet. So that was just one. And that was the way that I did it. I did a ketogenic version because of my seizures. I had so many with the illness. And at first, a bazillion times worse. I mean, my seizures went through the roof. The first month was horrific. The first 4 months were horrific. The first 6 months were horrific. But at the end of the first month, my monthly nerve check up at Cleveland Clinic, my neuromuscular doctor was so astounded by my nerves functioning. At the time, it was still thought that nerves couldn't regrow. It was very much a belief in the medical system that was the case. And I was showing regrowth. And so he didn't know what I was doing, but he was a wonderful, wonderful man, not just a wonderful doctor, just a really wonderful man. And he came out and he said, whatever you are doing, keep doing it. And I'm so grateful for him, because had I gone by my symptoms, I would have quit. I would have thought I was harming myself, And so having that confirmation that on the cellular level I was repairing was very good. So anyway, I kept up with it. And by the end of the year, I was in full remission. And after that, you go through something so serious, so expensive, for the American listeners, you know how expensive healthcare is. And then chronic healthcare where medications aren't covered, and it is astronomical. So to go through something that expensive, time, energy, emotions, a family cost, right? And then to turn it around with your groceries is mind-boggling. Mind-boggling. So I had quite a religious fervor after that. And I knew better than to preach on my loved ones, because nobody likes that. So instead, I went back to school. I finished my undergrad and then went back to school for postgrad in nutrition.
All right. So getting into the diet along the storyline here, were you on a vegan vegetarian diet when you read about the Maasai?
I was.
Okay, and then you started to incorporate what at that time, before you got to the soup diet?
First was dairy. So I started bringing in high-fat dairy, specifically like Fage yogurt and butter. I brought that in while I was sourcing a good source of red meat. Luckily, I had a wonderful farm in the city. So really good grass-fed meat. And those were my first two that I brought in.
And it sounds like you didn't really get better until you went on the soup diet. How much did symptoms improve with that first switch?
A good amount, really. Like when I went low carb, a lot of my pain went away, not my neuropathic pain, but the other pain, the muscular pain and those things. And cutting out the fruit, going low carb had other benefits as well. I stopped getting sick all the time and things like that. So it wasn't enough to where I could work or function in society, but it was very perceptible. And I could do more than just be in bed. I could actually move about the house and things like that, which is actually a massive change, because then I could start building my strength and building my lifestyle things and things like that.
And then when you went to the soup, you took a step back. You mentioned your seizures got worse.
Yes.
So you took a step back for two steps forward in the long run.
Yeah, most things I tried to think of it as a broken bone or something like that. Because I was an athlete growing up and I'm a bit reckless. I'm sure you can tell I don't have a lot of fear. So I broke a lot of things growing up. And so anyone who has broken anything knows that the healing process is far less comfortable than the initial break, right? The process of being in that cast, the itchiness, the pain, all of that, it's not comfortable. And so I just really tried to think about healing the illness like healing anything else, that it's going to be more tender, right? You cut your hand, even a paper cut, the process of when it's repairing the tissue, that's when it's the most painful. So I tried to think of it like that. And I also tried to get a bit of distance from the drudgery of day to day and look at it from a strategic point of view. I've never been a chess player. I mean, like I can play chess. Everybody can play chess, but it's not my game. And when I go about life or friendships, I'm never strategizing. I'm more checkers. I'm like, oh, that door is open. Let's check that out. That looks like fun. But I realized with illness, if you respond negatively because everything is uncomfortable. And so if you go in with, okay, I'll try this and then see how you feel is not likely going to be good. And it's going to be very hard to read because anyone with chronic illness, the symptoms fluctuate through the days and each day and each week. And so I kind of stepped back and decided to be very strategic about it and really focus on, okay, there's all these red herrings, there's all these distractions, the different organs and all of that. What is at the core? The core is the nervous system and the immune system. What do those systems need? That's going to be my focus. Now, how long do they take to repair themselves? Every part of our body repairs itself in a continuous cycle, and each thing has a different clock. So, like the liver, 6 months, hormonal system, 3. Each area has a different time that it gets repaired. So with the nervous system being 6 months, I gave it 6 months, and I promised myself I would not judge how I was feeling. Thank goodness for that, because had I gone based on how I felt, I never would have made it. At 6 months, I turned. And so it was really fortunate. And just for a little bit, right? Because as with anything, training for a sport or trying to get into a program, there's highs and lows constantly. We can look back on it as like a clear road, but it never is when you're in it. It's very counterintuitive. One day is good, one day is 10 times worse. And it's back and forth and back and forth. And so giving it that full 6 months was really imperative for me, and the way that my psychology works. I'm sure not everyone has to do that, but for me, it was very effective. And also, the whole thing is illness, anything difficult is very humbling, and it always humbles you on a level that you didn't think you could even go to. And each time it's surprising, right? But starting to see the illness as a teacher, as what could I learn today from this? What character growth could I get from this symptom in this moment right now? Doing that for so many years when I was bedbound was very, very helpful for the healing phase because, at 6 months, I started to improve. I was still sick, like very, but then at 8 months, my kidney tanked and it got worse than it had been in years. And it did that for a month and then recovered. And then I went into remission 3 months later. And so there's all these times where it's almost like, I don't know about you, I had to think about it mythologically, like the testing of the hero. You're climbing up the mountain to slay the dragon. And each turn of the switchback, there could be a new monster that you have to face. And it's a bit of a test of, do you really want this? Is this something that you really want, kind of thing? And so looking at it from an archetypal stance was very helpful. But yeah, it was very up and down, but very good.
Okay, so you're 2 years just on soup.
Mm-hmm.
What exactly is in the recipe?
Oh, yeah, I can tell you. I got a huge pot. I got it from Walmart. They delivered. It was the first time I had shopped at Walmart in like 15 years. But it was the place to go because they have things for canning. So they had this big pot. Now you could use Amazon. And I would put 3 whole chickens in there, water, salt, about 3 carrots, and maybe 2 to 3 onions. And then I would bring it to a simmer very slowly. If you really let something boil, it changes the flavor. The cooks will know that out there. So I'd let it simmer. And then once it got to a simmer, I would turn down the heat and cook it for 2 hours from that point. So it's not a bone broth. It's a slow cook meat broth is what it is. And it's not in a crock pot or anything that speeds it up. In the last 10 minutes, I would add some parsley or some celery just for flavor and then pull that out at the end. So that would be my chicken soup. Now I would pull out the chickens, debone them, and then I kept everything separate. So I kept my chicken in a Pyrex, my carrots in a Pyrex, my onions, because I was doing real medical ketosis where you don't just lower your carbs, you actually see that you're in ketosis. So that way I could know how many vegetables I could have or how many carbs. And then what I would have on top of that would be massive amounts of ghee, like ungodly amounts of ghee. It gave everything flavor and made it delicious. And I would add that on top. So when I served the soup, especially if I deconstructed it. So, really by day 3, you don't ever want to look at chicken soup again, really. Even though it tastes very good, it's just you get tired of it. And so I started doing other things. So I would deconstruct it. I'd have a plate of the boiled meat and vegetables from the soup and then broth on the side. And I would just drown the meat and vegetables in salt and ghee. And that was very effective. So, but yeah, a very simple recipe, really, and delicious.
So throughout the 2 years, you're measuring ketones, making sure you're in ketosis at least part of the time.
Yes.
Do you ever leave ketosis, or is it just a 24/7 thing?
Yeah, not then. No, not then. Now, yes. I luckily don't have to be on any specific diet now. But then I was very tight on it. Yeah, it just made such a difference in my life. So there was no desire. I always loved mangoes. Mangoes were like my jam. And when it came off carbohydrates, so really lowered my carbohydrates. And then I went back and had a mango. The pain that shot through my body and stayed there for days made it very demotivating to eat mangoes. So I really had learned through the years certain things that maybe didn't get me into remission, but were extremely helpful. And that was one. So yeah, I did stay in ketosis through that whole time.
Earlier, you touched on supplements. Did you
Mhm.
add any supplements in throughout the 2 years?
No, I did the opposite. I cut them down. I had been taking a ton and I did do some, but really the goal of that microbiome shifting diet, when you really want to regrow the villis within the gut lining, is to do as little as possible. And because now it's much better. Now there's some really beautiful companies out there that are very clean, but then things weren't regulated very well. So you could have starch in a supplement and not know it. So unless that supplement was giving you life, you would not have it, just to be careful when doing the soup diet. But I did do a lot before that, like thousands. And some were very, very effective. But I was at a stage there where I could cut back. So no, I really didn't. I think for a while I did St. John's wort as an antiviral. It's a very good antiviral. But I wasn't getting sick, so I stopped that. I had done an 8-chain glyconutrient supplement for a long time that really had reversed the ANA and done wonderful things. But I did pause it while I was on the diet. So yeah, I can't think of anything else that I took while I was on it.
Take me through the current diet. So if you're in a place living with traditional people, are you consuming the way they eat, or do you bring some of your nuance into it? And then when you're back home, how do you eat? And where is home right now?
Okay, well, I'm in transition. I'm moving out of Greece, so I'm on a road trip. I just got to France just an hour before we got on. And I've been driving for the last 2 months with my huge dog. He's like a horse. He's wonderful. But I'm not sure. I'm deciding. I have a house in South Africa, but bringing my dog there is very difficult. So I may end up back in the States. We'll see. I'm looking at a really great hunter-gatherer archaeological program that's at a college in Dublin. So it's on pause right now, but if they reboot it, I would go there for that. So we'll see. It'll be a bit of a lottery. But what I eat. So because when I'm going to a place, I don't know if they've modernized or not. You never know until you go. And even with the same group, you could go 2 years later and it'd be very different. So I'll usually bring a good amount of things like smoked salmon or salami, things that aren't going to go bad, that don't take a lot of room and aren't too heavy. Now, sometimes that's invaluable, like my Greenland trip. I had almost a whole suitcase of that. But many places to have in between, right? When you're going into the like more modern towns before going into the more remote, where there you're good to go. You've got all the food to eat. Once you're with the communities, you have all the food you need. So when I'm with them, I really eat with them, and I eat whatever they're eating, and I eat the amount that they're eating and all of that. I don't stray from that. But I do bring emergency food when I can. Most of the places I go to, especially in the last couple of years, you're taking multiple remote, tiny planes to get closer. And with those, the weight limit is so strict. And so you really can't. Like on, most of my travels from this year, I did not bring food. I wanted it, but I didn't bring it. Now, when I'm home, that's different. Okay, so if I'm in Greece, I'm eating very Greek food, and not the Greek American food, but really Greek food. So the really good cooked meats, the really good chicken soup, yogurt every night for dessert. I love the yogurt so much in the clay pots. It's delicious. Lots of fried cheese. I eat fried cheese every single day. It's not like our mozzarella sticks. There's no breading. And I've adapted it, which I probably shouldn't admit. But if you get a waffle maker and then you put in the blocks of cheese into the waffle maker, you get these delicious, crispy waffles that have nothing but cheese. And the Greek cheeses, for some reason, they don't export, but there are thousands of them. If you go to a cheese counter, it is endless, the varieties. And some taste like bread, and some are, savory, and some are sweet. And so they really taste like bread. It's really good. I love those. Now, when I'm in America, I eat a bit different because I love Latin food. And because I can eat any food now, I still do my intermittent fasting. I'm not rigid about it, but I do it. But I do a lot of Brazilian foods and a lot of Mexican foods. So I will do a lot of like carne, like meats with the flavoring. And then I do the most vegetables when I'm in America. So I tend to kind of forget they exist. A lot of places I go, or they're like just some color on the plate that I'll often forget about. But when I'm in America, I'll do a lot more because I have the kitchens I'm used to, and the food and the groceries and all of that. And I don't care what they say about broccoli. I love broccoli. I could live on massive plates of broccoli, not alone. I would need a steak with it or chicken or something, but like, I love it with butter. So I will usually make a huge plate of broccoli every single day to eat off of, for sure, along with these little Brazilian breads. So a traditional bread throughout a lot of Latin America is not made with a flour, not a grain flour. It's made with tapioca or cassava or arrowroot, mixed with cheese and either ghee or olive oil, whatever the local, usually lard, and an egg. And they make these little dough balls that are small, and they're crispy on the outside and really gooey on the inside. And I make a crisscross after I bake them, and then put just as much butter as there is bun, and a ridiculous amount of salt, and just go into bliss. It's like my comfort food. Like some people go for, I don't know, whatever people eat for comfort food, but that is mine. I love it. And it never does me wrong. I stay healthy and good. So that would definitely be something I have there. I also will eat plantain chips when I'm in the States, whereas I don't eat those elsewhere. Plantains are a good starch if your microbiome is healthy. And you can get ones that are cooked in appropriate oils in the States, whereas most of Africa and places that you travel to, it's the real modern junky oils. So I'll eat those too. So basically, I go to Food Town when I'm in America. But everywhere else, I tend to eat rather regional. Like if I'm in Thailand, I'll eat a lot of the coconut soups and things like that. I don't tend to do the noodles and that kind of stuff. I really, just out of habit, don't tend to do those foods. But yeah, that's kind of how I eat.
And when it comes to plantain chips and other fried foods, what oils are you looking for?
Oh, ideally a stable animal fat, so a saturated fat is ideal. The saturated plant fats are fine too. So like a coconut oil or a palm oil would be fine with me because it's not going to go as rancid. But I don't do it if it's got like the canola, the soy, any of those.
And what about supplements these days? If you're in the US, is there certain ones that you take all the time or certain ones that you cycle in and out of?
I buy a lot when I'm in the States. It's actually very difficult to get good supplements in other countries. So I'll often bring a whole suitcase that I will then disperse to everyone I know for the different things. But the main one, I would say, with all my travels and with the places I go with the very severe infections that people can get, I usually will travel with benfotiamine, which is a fat-soluble form of B1 that helps to really help with a lot of the more severe infections, right? The more life-threatening. So I'll bring that. I will usually bring like a medicinal kit based on where I'm going. So like if I'm going to a place with specific African viruses, I'll have St. John's wort. I may not take those, but I'll have them in case anyone needs them. I'll usually buy quite a bit of probiotics to do tests. I will often have a little kitchen lab where I go, especially if I'm going to go somewhere for a while. And so I'll get things that I've read about, and I want to do an N1 test to see if I'm going to recommend it or not, or how you can better use it. I've been really kind of obsessed with serine, the amino acid serine lately. So I've been digging down that hole quite a bit and how it relates to nerves and nerve function. So I'll definitely get things that I've been researching and not able to get until I'm in the States, and I'll get those. But I don't have anything that I take religiously.
So, throughout your illness, before you got on soup, you were majority of the time on a vegan or vegetarian diet. It didn't work for you. But what I'm curious about, it seems like there's these two different camps when it comes to healing. People that swear by a plant-based diet or going to more of a carnivore diet. So when you're working with people, do you ever see plants working? And if so, in what cases?
I do, but I don't teach plant-based diets anymore. I did early on in my career for certain conditions. Like I would do Gerson's as an option for cancer. I gave people 3 options and they could choose. But really, you and I could have the exact same illness, and we could need very different protocols to get out of that. The plant-based approach is much better than the American diet right now. And so anytime you clean up a diet, there's a subset of people that are going to improve. With that, there's also a subset of knowledge. So you have different levels of knowledge in the nutritional and in the health world, and they're pretty bottomless. I mean, it could just keep going and going. But you'll have a subset of people that really like promote something like the plant-based life, often because they went into remission with that, right? And so they've got the religious fervor, and that's great. Like whatever gets you there, gets you there. That's great. The problem is that it's very much pushed on the public. So I think if the plant narrative wasn't pushed on the public so much around the world, really around the world, it wouldn't be so devastating. But the reality is it's not a solution for most, and it's not a permanent solution. So if you take the example of, I don't remember what it was called, but the man who did the documentary on the juice cleanse, and he lost all that weight and he went all around the country.
Yes.
You
Joe
remember that one?
Cross.
Yes, thank
I
you.
forget the name of the movie, but
Thank
he's been
you.
on the show way back in the day.
That's great. So that was amazing for him. And then a year later, it came back, right? His illness came back. And so what the what we're lacking is really a good public understanding and medical understanding of what certain foods do when. Plants, aside from the ones I mentioned that are very high in toxins, their act on the body is optional. We can have carbohydrates, we cannot. We can be very healthy on carbohydrates, we can be very healthy without them. They're not essential, but they can be useful. And they can be more useful in conditions that have a hormonal component. So sometimes with thyroid conditions or sex hormones, anything that's going to help bring fat-soluble toxins out through the liver, because some of those foods have soluble fiber, which binds to those fatty issues. And so it can pull it out and rid the body of the burden. But ultimately, what it is a detox. It's not a rebuild. So there are stages of the illness. Like maybe if I had gotten at my illness early enough, and there's certainly other illnesses that are more an issue of toxins, right? External toxins that have come in. And for that, if you do a lot of plants, that can be facilitated out. Now, if that's just a surface level issue and not the core, it'll come back like it did for that man, right? And so the problem with that is that you can't stay on a juice cleanse. You can't stay on a vegan diet, not lifelong, and be properly healthy. We can pretend that we're not part of nature all we want, but that is not a human or a mammalian diet. We don't have the digestion, the bacteria, any of that. So we can get on for a while and we can feel really good on it. But what I like to remind people is that most people know someone who's alcoholic, right? And if you know someone who's alcoholic, they'll swear that they feel better if they have a drink in the morning. And they're not being dishonest. That's very true. When we are used to a high toxin load and we bring more of that in, we can feel better. We see that with oxalates. If someone is used to eating spinach salads every day, we put them on carnivore, they will crumble very quickly. If you give them oxalates, it relieves them. Right? And so a lot of what we do, what makes us feel better, what perceptively feels better, is not actually what gets us to the goal line. The goal, in my mind, and maybe everyone has a different goal, but for me, when I worked with people and when I worked with myself, I didn't want to be on something for the rest of my life. I would do it. I would have done anything. But ideally, a real sign of health is having resilience and flexibility and not having to be rigid. And so you are disciplined for the period that your body needs. But then if you can't ever break out of that, then something's not right. Right? And that may be 5 years. I don't mean it in 6 months. I mean, like you may need a lot of time on whatever that is. But if you never break out, or if you do, it comes back, that is saying something. It's more of a medication approach to the illness as opposed to getting at the root. Right? And so most of the things that I see are things that need a rebuild, not a detox. Detox is always part of it, but our body is great at detoxing. We have all these detoxing organs, so you can give it a help, and sometimes it really does need it, but it does have that. What it often needs is rebuilding, and to rebuild the tissue, to rebuild a cell, the nervous system, immune system, those need fat and protein. And there's nothing better than saturated fat for rebuilding that. So if you go the strategy route, you'd go that way more. But I honestly, to be perfectly honest, I would teach whatever worked. All that matters is that people get better, right? And so, like I mentioned in the beginning about cancer, I used to let people choose because the Gerson diet is plant-based and it's aside from the liver, and it's very intensive, right? You have like 10 coffee enemas a day and all these juices. It's a lot of work, but some people prefer plants. And so I would let them do that over, say, ketosis or one of the other methods. But the success rate wasn't the same, not even close. And part of that could have been to compliance, right? So take that with a grain of salt. But after a few years, I just didn't even feel right allowing it or recommending it.
I want to talk about plant medicines.
Mm-hmm.
How often in your travels do you see these different cultures using those as part of their tradition? And how do you feel about it? Because here in the West, it seems to be gaining momentum. There's legalization starting to happen. We get the impression, at least I do here in the West, is that these are being used around the world. Is that true? And how do you feel about it?
Only kind of. So, well, I'm excited about it. I do like it, especially for some of these that are more expansive, because I had the benefit when I was bedbound of kind of going through that like crack in the psyche where things become beautiful, right? And that's really what people are experiencing when they take something like a mushroom, especially in a safe environment. They go through a really beautiful experience. They kind of see the magic of life again, which can be lost in adulthood and in stress and all of that. So in that way, I love it. I would like less legal restrictions on all of these things, really, anything that's not highly addictive, but it's not used as much. And this could be due to the communities that I go to, but there's a lot of myths. So for instance, there's a myth that was brought up in one of my podcasts, one of my Sami friends corrected, because I didn't know the answer. There's a myth that the reindeer in the Sami cultures up in the north, they eat the mushrooms and then urinate, and then people trip from, no, none of that. No, it's not true. Maybe in another culture, but not in
I've
theirs.
discussed that on the show. I've had a guest talk about that.
Yeah, it's not true. It's not true. And in most of the Amazonian communities that I've gone to, there's a lot of ayahuasca there, but there's 4 different types of ayahuasca. Only one of them creates hallucinations. And in all the communities I go to, they do the other 3. There are a couple exceptions. The other 3 are more medicinal, and they don't have the altered state. There are a couple exceptions. There's usually a shaman who is a real healer. Like if you get a snake bite, they can fix it. This isn't woo-woo. This is like they're very knowledgeable with the plants and what to do. And they will sometimes use them for guidance. Not necessarily for a specific illness, but like to guide the community. So, but they're taught how to handle those and how to use them. And it's sacred. It's very sacred. It's not for entertainment. That would be the biggest difference. Now, where I did go, where it was used a lot, was in the Mayan jungles. A lot of peyote. It's very sacred to the Toltecs and to the Mayans, and really beautiful when you know all the meanings behind it. But it's a very different thing. The way I see tourists come and do it, and digital nomads go and do it, and that kind of thing, to how it's done in the traditional cultures. The traditional cultures have the amount of reverence and respect and gratitude that they exude in every action, even before using one of these substances, is awe-inspiring. Is awe-inspiring. And then you bring that in, and it's a thing that they do together or for character building. So at least that's my assessment. Because with the peyote that's done in the Mayan jungles, the peyote it makes you tired, right? But the whole thing is held all night, for the whole night, and you have to stay up. And the idea is that you're supposed to give your gratitude to the fire, right? So you're supposed to sing if you sing, or dance, or these things, whereas your inclination would be to lay down and rest and kind of meditate and enjoy. And that's not the purpose. So it takes a lot of character to go against your circadian rhythm, to go against the act of the drug, and then to give and not take, right? A lot of drug usage is really more about personal taking and not producing and giving life. So I would say that would be the biggest difference in the way that I've seen that they're used.
All right. Well, thank you for sharing that. You have a unique perspective on the plant medicines, diet, lifestyle, a lot of different areas. So I appreciate you coming on and sharing. We're going to link up your social media, your website, everything in the show notes. Mary, this has been a real pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This has been lovely.
Now that you're done with Mary, you're going to want to stick around here and catch my chat with Jane. She's the author of The Great Plant-Based Con. You don't want to miss this. I'll see you over there.
The fact that they have these 3 legs, the health, the environment, and ethics, makes for this, what I sometimes refer to that as a 3-legged stool. It's pretty hard to kick over.